Hey, good people. James here. It's the end of a very, very busy week, and we decided to start doing a podcast, but because the fact that I'm in nature all the time, or I'm on a landscape, or I'm working with trees, a podcast hardly seemed like the best choice. The fact that I'm out in nature, even with a little bit of dog barking in the background, that's okay. This is going to be kind of our week wrap-up. Sophie, my assistant, is going to help me out as we sort of remember some of the challenges that we saw during the week, and we want to talk about some of the things that are coming up. So this is really just kind of a casual conversation about review of the week and what lies ahead, and the good side and the bad side, but I love to end the week in nature. Nature and trees and shrubs as they occur, well, naturally. So here I'm in a grove of white firs and canyon maples, and well, it looks like we've got a little bit of maybe even some scrub oak in the background. But yeah, it's been an interesting week as we come to the end of a really hot, brutal summer. As the trees are trying to go into their fall colors now, it's really showing, if it didn't already show, the challenges that we're faced by an extraordinarily dry winter again, an unusually warm winter again. That's why we're in the midst of this drought, like I talked about in the opening video that we did where we started out on Antelope Island. Now, even though I am at a higher elevation in the mountains in some indigenous trees, we're only a stone's throw away from the Salt Lake Valley because I'm up Mill Creek Canyon, which is one of several canyons that you can drive up directly from the Salt Lake. That's why we have such amazing skiing here. I wouldn't know, I don't ski, but you know, people come from all over the world to experience the canyons and the ski resorts here, and it is just a short drive up the canyon. So yeah, back on the drought situation and the struggle that a lot of trees have had is also people have been trying to comply with cutting water back so that they're not using so much on their lawns, which is brilliant for saving water. But a real careful precaution needs to be taken that they're not depleting their trees of water. Now, one of the unique things about trees in the landscape is that, again, as I talked about in that early episode, trees aren't really native to the valley here. And so every tree that gets brought in is really going to need good care. That's really going to need to be looked after and cared for based on, you know, where it's indigenous, the kind of soil it's indigenous to. I mean, these trees, really for all intents and purposes, as they come from the different growers and the different regions that they're indigenous or native to, they come to this environment, and I sometimes call them orphans. You know, that's a terrible, I realize, sort of phraseology and if you will, analogy, but that's the only word I can think of to describe the displacement from a native environment, a native growing situation. And so like the birches that we see in the huge stands back east, Midwest, Canada, you know, they are growing, they're growing in an environment where they have much more moisture and winter water, and oftentimes colder winters. So their dormancy experience and their watering experience, very, very different than what's going to experience here in the valleys along the Wasatch Front in Utah. So what's going to happen, unfortunately, we will see going into fall, and if measures are not taken to strengthen root systems by either watering or very targeted and specific types of fertilizations applied at the correct time, and that's a whole nother conversation. We're going to see trees continue to decline through the winter, and quite frankly, we'll see way too many of them die. One of the things that we talked about too, and this is, I'm jumping to a completely different topic, but we just at the end of the day here on Friday, we were taking care of a couple of trees that were simply planted too close to the house. And we see this over and over and over again, that the tree that's going to get 50 feet tall potentially and is going to be much too wide for the place that it's planted. You know, one of the things I really am disappointed in is when I see planting done with the ultimate demise of the tree already part of the equation. So in one case we're trying to trim a columnar purple beech away from a house, and the trunk is literally 2 feet away from the house. Well, it's imperative that you pay attention to how big the tree is going to get. Do your research, but don't just rely on a salesman. That's not to say that sales people at the nursery are incompetent or anything, but it's worth additional research to find out just exactly how big these trees are going to get. And most cities have access to some kind of arboretum or park, someplace where they can go out and look at the trees that are thriving. Look at the trees that are doing really, really well. Those are the trees that you should be planting. And the trees that are getting really big, those are not the trees you should be planting next to your house. Even something as simple as a crabapple that we pruned, which doesn't get very big, but again, unfortunately, too close to the house. And so what do we have? We have something that is smushed in the canopy, as it were, up against the house, the gutter, the roof, and looks like it's going to practically tip over because it is growing magnificently on the other side. So when design is being done, when the architects or the landscape designer or a homeowner's kind of DIYing a design, again, it may look really nice going in, it may look really idyllic, but what's happening 10, 15, 30 years down the line? Have you essentially a death sentence for the tree because you planted it too close to the house? So I'm gonna ask Sophie, who is behind the camera, my assistant, to kind of give me some ideas of some other things that we maybe talked about.
So some of the things that we talked about, or you just mentioned, was the purple colander.
Oh yeah, the purple columnar beech.
And you do recommend that to be planted next to the house typically.
Yes, because it's a really good, as a matter of fact, we're working on a design right now where I called out specifically because the columnar, you know, it's kind of that flame shape when you see the flame on a candle. That's what's lovely about the columnars, is they're not going to have a big spreading canopy. So they're very appropriate for those tight plantings. But it's just know how wide the columnar is going to get, because a Swedish aspen or a European aspen is going to have a much narrower canopy than something like a columnar beech. And then you get into some of the columnar oaks, and they're even wider, or the the columnar.
So just because the word colander is in the name doesn't mean it's going to be appropriate to be next to your house.
Right, because you think of columnar like a column. Okay, it's like the pillars of, you know, the Parthenon or something like that. It's going to grow in a column shape, but it will, depending on the species, have a very different width. So yes, the columnar purple beech are one of my favorite to use, because they do get so tall, and they're great for those real sort of monolithic. We're using it to put in the center of the side of a house, in front of a chimney that is simply painted a very neutral color. And so it kind of stands out. It almost feels like it's going to fall over on you. But we're using that columnar purple beech to soften that and to give us a nice background, because in that particular location, it's highly photographed because it's a very public place.
Okay, and then another thing that you mentioned is the Memory Grove house. So we did that this week.
Right. We're
doing
collaborating with the Memory Grove house, which is in Memory Grove in Salt Lake City, to put together a design that more, if I can say, appropriately works with the architecture of the house. Right now, it's very English cottage, where there's just a plethora of random perennials and annuals that are put in place, and it deserves, because the architecture is very specific with the dormers and the shutters and the artistry that's represented there, that we can do a really nice complement in the beds to accentuate, or at least work, as it were, aesthetically collaborative with what's gone on with the architecture, which again, it's not an English cottage. Okay, it's something that has a very, very specific architecture, and yeah, we'll be representing that later. We'll probably be showing that, and we have
people who are home can't see how many mosquitoes.
Yeah, can't see how many mosquitoes there are up here in the forest.
More mosquitoes than I've ever seen.
Yeah, well, that's you know,
Portland.
welcome to September in the mountains. In
yeah, right on your forehead.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've seen, and we had a client today, and they were concerned about this, is scorched leaves.
Right. And the scorching happens for multiple reasons. And by scorching, what we're talking, I should have had a leaf to show, but right along the edges where it turns brown, it can happen because of drought. And we've been experiencing a lot of drought here. And some of my early comments were about the results of backing the water off of your lawn excessively, or I guess not really excessively, but just too much for that specific variety of tree. Where that
so this leads me into a really interesting question. Can you possibly have too much water during a drought? That seems kind of, how can I overwater my trees during a drought? That seems kind of like an oxymoron.
Right. And it's easy to do. I mean, you can, there's a saying that a person can drown in just a few inches in a bathtub. Okay, and that's kind of where this goes. You can, by keeping water on the root system of a tree and not letting it drain through, as it were, the soil, and letting those air spaces open, or so it can get oxygen, those spaces between the roots. That's how you can overwater. It's just like you can keep watering in a limited space too frequently, even in a drought, because the fact of the matter is that the root systems can only take up so much water based on the system of the tree. And you can actually do damage by not allowing that root system to have the oxygen exchange that it needs to have.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a good question. So it is a tricky dance, especially in our clay soils here along the valley. And again, that's in the valley. We know we have an issue here that's very different when we get up on the benches along the Wasatch Front, because we have very sandy soil. Okay. And that becomes a whole different dialogue in terms of watering.
And so we were talking about scorched leaves, and you said multiple reasons.
Oh yeah, multiple reasons, because not only, I mean, the drought oftentimes is the least of the problems here along the Wasatch Front. A lot of times it has to do with nutrients, micronutrients quite often, where the natural process that's in the leaf isn't able to function because the leaf doesn't have everything that it needs, i.e. chlorophyll to photosynthesize. If it goes into an iron chlorotic situation and that chlorophyll is diminished or not, essentially not present, the process can be on a green leaf tree. It can go from green to very pronounced dark green veins, which is a response obviously of the leaf, and it'll keep going till it bleaches out and then scorches.
So when you look at a leaf, to identify a leaf if it has scorches because of a nutrient deficiency, you first look at the veins, or what's your process of diagnosing? Well,
you know that there's an issue with the leaf when you start seeing that discoloration that has that pattern. Now, it can possibly be not iron chlorosis. I mean, in the soils around here, with the plants that are not adapted well to the pH of the soil, which is high, as we know. We're in a range. I think we're probably in a range anywhere from 7.5 to, I don't know, maybe even 8.5. Actually, I do know. I don't know why I said I don't know. But I mean, it is a pretty significant range, which is very different from where I'm from in the Willamette Valley, just south of Portland, where we were doing just the opposite, because we would have a very similar response in lawns and certain shrubs, and so we would be trying to bring the alkalinity in to get closer to a base, which is 7.
Interesting. So you, in Oregon, you would be doing the same thing but in reverse. So you had a lot of plants that were suffering.
Yeah, we would have plants that were suffering because they were not getting they were not getting the nutrients they needed because the soil was too acidic. So. Yeah, the challenges are very different here. And people will ask me, well, how can I fix the soil, or how can I change up the soil? Well, it's kind of cost prohibitive, because you would literally have to put in, sulfur to sweeten the soil, as we say sometimes, to bring that pH up. And so what we do instead, first of all, the best thing is to plant wisely. Plant something that isn't going to struggle with the pH of the soil, and stop asking the nurseries to sell you stuff that is just going to be an ongoing maintenance issue.
So that kind of leads us, so I'm going to leave that blank, because that's a future video.
Yeah.
We're working on that currently.
Oh, right.
Is the different trees that that also kind of segues into you were asked by Utah County, one of the biggest gardening companies out there, to teach.
Right.
So speak about, not necessarily the company itself, you don't need to name it, but just speak about the role that they hired you to do.
Right, because as a consulting arborist and a diagnostician, I get asked to come in and not only assess what's going on, the causation, but also repair. And you and I, we do construction markouts so that the least amount of impact that I mean, look at these mature trees around us. And this would be a lovely setting to have a home, but we want to know, how can we preserve the trees? So that's kind of thing one that I get asked to do, is to preserve trees. And then trees that are impacted by construction, what can be done to best ensure that those trees do not fail or suffer unnecessarily, etc. And then, of course, on the teaching end, it's about helping people understand how best to not only select the right plant varieties, and I use the word plant because I obviously have a broader horticultural background than just being an arborist. So there's shrubs and there's perennials and even annuals. And all of those have to be the right varieties to not struggle with the soil issues that we talked about. And then, of course, irrigation gets to be a whole nother issue, because one of the things that's imperative, and then this again is something that I'm consulting on, is what is the best care for a newly planted tree, typically, but shrub or whatever the case may be, to help it establish. Because there's certain parameters that, they're kind of generalization, but we say for every inch of caliper, for example, of a tree's diameter, when it is brought from a grower to this area, we need a minimum of that many years. So if it's a 2-inch caliper tree, for 2 years, it's going to need to establish, and it's going to need care that will help it establish. You don't just wrap it around with 3 or 2 drip emitters 4 inches from the trunk and set the timer and expect the tree to establish over the next 2 years, because establishment means reestablishing the root system that...
So let's talk about that for a second.
Okay.
So we have a client over on Oneida Street, which on one of our first jobs that we had, we planted their maple. And every time we go to check on their maple, it was a replacement maple, I feel like the tree is dying. And you always say, oh no, it's fine. Why do you say that about that tree?
Well, I'm looking at the whole tree. So I'm looking at the root system, I'm looking at the trunk, I'm looking at the stems, I'm looking at the buds that are going to come out next year.
Okay.
So yes, there is some heat stress in that tree. There's a condition we call transplant shock. Okay, so a tree gets brought from the grower in the Pacific Northwest somewhere, and it gets brought here. It is going to very likely suffer a certain amount of shock. And so that's what I'm seeing in that particular tree, is predominantly shock. Now, next spring when the leaves come out, I may see something very different. I may see that the root system is not doing what it's supposed to, but we've been taking care of that tree. We've been doing all the things that I'm recommending that needs to be done in order to help that tree get its best establishment. What's going to be most important for that tree is what we do for it during the winter.
So if I was a person and I bought a tree at the nursery and I took it home and I planted it in the ground and it just started to
wilt immediately.
I do not need to run and undig that tree and plant another one. I just need to wait it out. For how long would you give it?
Well, again, this gets back to how long it's going to take to establish. Because if optimal conditions have been provided for that tree, again, I anticipate if it's a 2-inch caliper tree, it can shock for quite some time before so that's basically a decline before it starts making an ascent, as it were, into a better place, a better strength or whatever. I mean, not to be funny or anything, but I went through a little bit of transplant shock relocating from the Pacific Northwest to this.
You're still going through transplant
Well,
shock. You're always got half a boot out the state.
Well, I just remember one of the things that I was particularly sensitive to when I first came here was how dry it was. And so I was having physiological responses to the dryness of this area.
I get that way when I go down south to visit my mother, who lives
Right further.
next to St. George.
Yeah.
And last time I was there, I had to cut half my hair off because it dried in the 2
Oh,
weeks I was there, and
goodness.
just knotted
Goodness.
because it was just
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean,
That's a good metaphor to think about with your own trees.
yeah, that they're really going to. And speaking of metaphors, I think about somebody who gets a new puppy. Okay, think about how much care that puppy needs. Pretty much constant care, or any.
But not constant care in the way that you just keep shoveling food into its mouth until it chokes to death on its
Right.
Same with the watering.
Right, same with the watering. I mean,
So
it's
what do you
you're
mean
not.
by constant care?
Well, that you just can't put a dish of food in front of and a random amount of food in front of the dog and a random amount of water, and just walk away. It has things to do to grow, and whether it's a puppy or a calf or a child, or I mean, I only use these because I've raised dogs and I've raised cattle and I've raised children. Everything goes from infancy into, as it were, adolescence and adulthood with, the care of someone, a group, a community, whatever the case may be. And trees are no different. Trees, especially in this environment here, trees really need attention. Shrubs really need attention. It's just not a plug and play kind of thing. This is a living organism that needs care, that needs attention.
Will you be speaking more about this topic at the Home and Garden?
Yeah,
the home show.
The home show. We've got a home show. I do speak at home and garden shows and home shows, and this particular one that's coming up. This is the one that will be the 8th, 9th, and 10th of October at the Mountain American, I think it is, Expo Center in Sandy, Utah. I'll be there. We'll be there. Have a booth, but I will be speaking on the stage, and I'm going to.
That's the Deseret News.
The Deseret News home show, and I'll be speaking about these very topics because a lot of people are thinking about it. A lot of people are concerned. We know because we get a plethora of calls every day, and these are coming in from not just us, but they're coming in from the nursery too, because the nursery is reaching out to us. And
this is a good segment to talk about what it is that we do. This is what we do. We consult.
Right. Again, we're consulting, and we're teaching. I mean, that's kind of and of course, I'm always. Oh, that's right. Yeah, I do consult on designing, and sometimes if somebody twists my arm really hard, I will do a design. But I'm if anybody's had me on their landscape, they know I'm always full of stories because I'm always storytelling too. But that's one of the things I love to do out here in nature is that I take people on guided tours of nature and tell the stories of the trees and tell the wisdom of the trees. It's like I tell people, everything I know in life I learned from a tree. So there's a lot to know, lot of things going on. But anyway, getting back to the home show, I'll be speaking on the main stage and talking about how to deal with some of the rather drastic issues that we're facing at the end of a pretty hellacious year for trees.
Hellacious.
Yeah, good word.
It's been kind of like watching a slow death.
Yeah.
It's. I think you started in June to say you're seriously worried for the trees.
Oh yeah.
And I didn't really understand, but then as the season progressed, I became seriously worried for the trees as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm seeing as I go into as we go into fall, and Monday I was up hiking at elevation, top of passes and whatnot, and the natural setting is extraordinarily dry as well. We just didn't get the snowfall that we normally got last year.
I've heard is that we're going to have another drought in the winter.
Yeah, we're going to have another dry winter, which is really something I should talk about too. Well, I'll be talking about it at the home show, is that there are certainly trees that need water. Not just trees, but we'll go into that later. Because there's research that shows that trees go into winter drought stress all the time. But I think we're going to do a video about that. And I don't want to give too much away there.
That's okay.
I'm putting together some classes that I think are going to be really exciting for people, because I really want to go into neighborhoods. And what I'm looking for and wanting to provide is groups, whether they're gardening groups, whether they're church groups, whether they're bowling leagues, whatever it is, people that sort of share a common ground. There always seems to be one really good gardener that they can go to. And I really want to empower those people to be a resource, at least for sort of those rudimentary things that they'll know about trees, and I love to go into these neighborhood settings and help people. HOAs are a great one. We were talking about an HOA, and we're going to be doing that next spring for that same HOA, where we're going to be going in and just saying, this is what is going on with your soil, because they all have the same soil. And these are the kinds of trees and shrubs and perennials and whatnot that you should be putting in. So I'm going to be building some curriculums, as it were. And also I'm going to be putting together a presentation for the home show, because I really want to get to the core of what's going on, going wrong. And I would just really love plants, particularly trees, to come out next spring and really be ready for whatever the season is going to throw at them. So that's probably what I'm most excited about, is just the education.
That is very exciting. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for watching. And we're going to do these Friday sort of wrap-ups each Friday. Love sitting in the mountains and kind of summarizing what's gone on. And, as I always say, if you can't hug a tree, hug an arborist, but hug a tree.